Hello, I'm doing a book review, and I'm joined by my friend Chris.
How's it going, guys?
Not to be confused with another friend of mine named Chris, who also sometimes does reviews with me. I know it would be easy to get them confused. They both wear glasses. But the book we're reviewing is The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, which we both have the same
copy.
Yeah, the same copy of. The Exorcist was published in 1971. Now, William Peter Blatty, prior to this, wrote a lot of comedies in the 60s, and it's kind of funny how somebody who was primarily known for comedies ended up writing a pretty hardcore psychological drama. And the book was inspired by a real-life exorcism that took place in, I want to say, the late 40s or early 50s. I guess that all depends on if you buy into that.
Right.
Yeah.
And stuff where he was like talking in like something that didn't sound like his voice. Like I heard he was like spitting like 20 feet away.
Now, this was also the basis for the 1973 film of the same name, which was directed by William Friedkin, and he has a poster for it right there. We're going to talk more about the movie and its sequels and the cultural impact that the film had after we discuss the book. So, what do you think of The Exorcist?
The Exorcist? Well, I started by watching the movie when I was 8 years old with my dad and brother. I thought, oh, this can't be that scary, whatever. And then I basically had to sleep in my parents' room that night. But after I got used to all that, it became one of my favorite movies, and then I decided to read the book in 10th grade. And I thought, wow, the book's even better. So, what I like about it is that the religious aspects of it, it's so coherent in the movie, but in the book, it's almost as if you don't have to be that religious to understand the book, because it could be more, maybe it's the medical issues that's going on.
Yeah.
Or something. So, that I like. I also like how Father Karras, he's a really relatable character in the book. I feel like it's not all about religion with him. He's a priest.
But he also approaches it as a psychiatrist.
Yes, he does that first of all, to prove out anything.
Now, The Exorcist, I would say, is definitely almost like a Catholic's response to the state of religion at the time. Like, in the late 60s and early 70s, in America at least, religion was really being called into question, and the church was really being called into question. And William Peter Blatty was a Catholic, and I very much view the book as a Catholic's response to all that. But I would argue that the book's not really preachy. Like, it's not saying, oh, you have to be a Catholic, otherwise you're a bad person. Like, the character of Chris McNeil is an atheist, and she kind of remains an atheist even by the end of it. So I think the book's ultimately saying just believe what you want to believe. And I view the book as more of a humanistic novel. Like, it is a religious novel, but it's also very much about it's also very much about self-sacrifice and doing good for your fellow man.
More about like what you believe and all that. The big thing in the book and the movie, I would say, is power of suggestion. Like, if you believe this will work, then it could work.
Yeah.
So.
Now, the plot of The Exorcist is it's about an actress named Chris McNeil who's in Washington, D.C. shooting a movie, and she's staying at this house, and she's there with her 12-year-old daughter, Reagan, and Reagan finds this Ouija board that Chris bought a few years prior to the events of this story, and Reagan makes what is apparently an imaginary friend who she calls Captain Howdy. Chris just kind of brushes this off, but as the story goes on, Reagan starts to go through these mood swings, and these mood swings get progressively worse and worse, and basically it gets to a point where her entire personality starts to change, and it gets to a point where Chris is worried that she might have to actually institutionalize Reagan, and it kind of becomes apparent, or at least it's suggested, I guess it all depends on how you interpret the story, that Reagan might actually be possessed, either by the spirit of Satan himself, or just a demon, like they mentioned the demon Pazuzu in the story, or maybe a group of demons, and Chris contacts a priest who is struggling with his faith named Father Damien Karras, and Karras at first approaches it as a psychiatrist, like, he thinks Reagan's just mentally ill, but as it goes on, he starts to become convinced that there is something supernatural going on, and eventually the church contacts an old exorcist named Father Merrin. Father Lancaster Merrin.
Yep.
Yeah. What do you think of the characters overall in this book?
Overall, well, I'll talk about Damien Karras first of all. I feel like he's a really relatable character, and nothing to do with the priesthood or anything, just who he is as a man. Like, he has a very sick mother, we find out, and just him, like, going to his house and then having to put her in an institution or whatever. It's just, like, no man would want to have to do that to his mother, and just seeing that take a hold of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
It's a really, not to cut you off, but it's a really heartbreaking aspect of the story.
Yeah.
And also, you know, the whole, like, the thing that really gets to me about this book and the movie as well is not so much the whole idea of Reagan being possessed by the devil, but it's really the whole idea of what Chris is going through. Like, the horror of seeing this happen to your daughter, regardless of if it's anything supernatural or not. In a way, it's actually even scarier if it's not supernatural. Like, what if it is just split personality or something?
Yeah, what are you going to do about that then?
Yeah.
Because empowered suggestion won't work with that, so. Also, with Chris, she, her husband pretty much just left her. So you have, Reagan and Chris just fending for themselves, basically.
And there's also, in the book, you do find out that Chris had a son a few years prior to that who actually died.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why she has a sort of mistrust of doctors. Or distrust, I should say. And the book really does kind of show you the pros and cons of both science and religion. But ultimately, it kind of breaks it down to what I personally believe, that science and religion are just man's way of trying to understand the world and just trying to understand forces that maybe we're not meant to understand.
Absolutely.
To go back to Father Karras, I agree with you. He's an extremely relatable character. I relate to him myself because, I was raised Catholic, so I kind of and I've certainly have had my doubts, and I still kind of, I'm still kind of, on that fence of, I believe in God, but I don't really know where I want to be with religion, so it's kind of, I related to him a lot in that regard. And I think it's really interesting how throughout the whole thing, even towards the end, he still doesn't fully believe that Reagan is possessed. It's still, he really does approach it as a psychiatrist first and foremost. Now, in the book, there's a subplot where you find out that, now Chris MacNeil, she has these servants working for her, and there's a whole subplot involving their daughter where the mother of the daughter, the female servant, actually thinks her daughter is dead, but turns out her daughter is alive and is actually a drug addict, and the servant Carl is kind of secretly supplying money to his daughter so she could get drugs. I don't think it's so she could get drugs. I think he wants her to use the money for something else, but drugs is what she's doing it for. What did you think of that subplot in the book?
I thought it was interesting. You got to see what the caretakers were all about in the movie. I mean, they were just kind of there. The detectives, they kind of accused them of some stuff, and you didn't really know why. But in the book, you see, how secretive Carl is, and, what he'd go, all the extremes he would go for his daughter and everything. So.
And that's interesting because in the book, there's certain moments where you can tell Carl really does care for Reagan, and you get the sense that he sees a little bit of his daughter in Reagan.
Yeah.
Think of the character of Bill Kinderman, the detective in the story.
I thought he was interesting. One thing, he was just trying to do his job. And another part, I felt the way he was talking about Chris, how much he loved Chris MacNeil's acting and stuff, did he really? Or was he just trying to, get more info out of Chris to see what Reagan's all about?
Yeah, I know some people will find him to be kind of annoying, and I actually did find him to be a little annoying in this book. He gets better, William Peter Blatty wrote a sequel to this called Legion, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but Kinderman's the main character of Legion, and I thought he was much better in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Here, I thought he was a little bit... I almost want to say he was a little bit of a stereotype of a detective, but what do you think of the character of Lancaster Merrin, who I find to be kind of a very minor character, even though he's technically the titular character of the whole book?
I feel like he is important because, you don't really know too much about him, but, you can definitely tell there's something hidden that you want to know more about him. In the beginning, he's taking these pills, he's very shaky, and then you see him... he's dealt with this demon before that's possibly in Reagan. So basically, I feel like this was Father Merrin's and the demon Pazuzu, if you want to call him, basically their last stand together.
Yeah. Now, to get into a discussion on who you would call the protagonist of the novel, you could say Chris is the protagonist because this is really her story. It's like about what she's going through, seeing this happen to her daughter. But then you also have Father Karras, and I would almost argue that Chris and Damien are almost like dual protagonists in the story. Like, on one level, you could read it as you could read the book as a story about a mother trying to save her daughter, but then you can read it about a priest who's struggling with his faith and is now confronted by what is possibly evidence of God's existence when he's confronted by what could be Satan himself.
I would suggest that, I would say, more so, it would be Father Karras.
Okay.
Because just so much you learn about him. Like, with Chris McNeil, you know she's an actress, she has a daughter, she's raising her by herself, and that she wants to save her at the end. That's pretty much what you get from her. With Karras, you get an understanding of it. His mother's in the hospital now. She died. You know, he doesn't know how to feel about that. He's going through different stuff with his faith, whether he believes or not. And now he's going to save this girl with just, you know, his whole story arc is just...
And even by the end, I don't know if we want to give away spoilers or not, but the ending, he almost becomes, dare I say, Christ-like by the end, if you want to interpret it that way. And also, his name is actually pretty important because Father Merrin even mentions this at one point, that the name Damien comes from a saint who was taking care of these lepers, like these people with leprosy, and he ended up inheriting the disease himself, and that kind of ties in with everything that happens with Damien in this story.
Yeah.
Now, of course, in the book, there are a lot of themes about, like, the nature of good and evil in man, whether or not the evil in man's heart is attributed to Satan, or is it just human nature. There's a lot about the existence of God, or the possible existence of God. But ultimately, I think it's a very humanistic story, just about what sacrifices will you make for your fellow man, and, like, what will you do to help a person who is in dire need.
Right.
I do consider it a horror novel, but it's also very much a drama. You could view it as a theistic drama, or you could view it as just a human drama.
Like, what you were saying before, like, how you're just reaching out. Like, you can tell how much Chris really wanted to reach out to Father Karras. And Father Karras at first, like, seemed like trying to push her off to somebody else. And then she was just like, just help me. Can you just help me?
Yeah.
So then he goes to see Reagan and sees what he can do.
Now, in the novel, there is sort of this sense of doubt where, like, it's almost implied that maybe Reagan isn't possessed at all, and it's just, like, possibly split personality. And that's kind of a big conflict in the story, is, was she really possessed, or was this all in her head? And the book never really gives you a clear resolution to that. The only thing I will say is there are supernatural things that happen, but it explains that it might have been telekinesis.
Yeah.
The book kind of treats telekinesis like a serious scientific phenomenon, and I don't think that's ever really been proven.
Right.
You could tell this was written in the 70s, because in the 70s there was like a huge interest in psychic phenomenon. So, any closing thoughts on the novel The Exorcist?
Well, when I finished The Exorcist, I was like, alright, it's definitely different from the movie, whereas in, you know, like, alright, she was possessed. With the book, I had to really think about this, like, alright, maybe she wasn't possessed, maybe it was something else entirely.
Yeah, I think The Exorcist is a great novel. It's a great horror novel, but also a great drama. It's a great book. Like, if you are a Catholic, like, I do think it's a really good book about faith, but I don't think it's too preachy, where if you're not a Catholic, or if you're an atheist or something, I think you could just still enjoy the book. But ultimately, I think it's a very powerful human drama. Now, William Peter Blatty wrote 2 sequels to this book. One was more of a spiritual sequel, and the other was more of a direct sequel. In 1978, he published the novel The Ninth Configuration, which in and of itself was actually a rewritten version of an earlier novel from Blatty called Twinkle Twinkle Killer Kane, but then he rewrote the book to be a spiritual sequel to this novel, and while The Ninth Configuration is not a horror story, it does touch on a lot of the same themes about the nature of good and evil in man and the possible existence of God and faith, and also it is set in the same universe as The Exorcist. In this book, there's a scene where Chris MacNeil is having a party at her house, and one of the guests at this party is an astronaut who's about to go to the moon, and then Reagan comes up to him and says, "You're gonna die up there." That character is actually one of the main characters of Ninth Configuration, where you find out his name is Billy Cutshaw. You've read Ninth Configuration, right?
Yep. Yeah, this guy got me into it before Christmas, so I got it for Christmas, I read it, and I was pretty amazed by it.
Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah. It's actually, I personally like it better than The Exorcist, but that's just me. Yeah. I personally think, granted, I have not read, I've only read the 3 books in this trilogy by Blatty, so I haven't read any of his other books, but in my personal opinion, I think it might very well be his masterpiece, that book.
Yeah, and when you were talking about before how he was a humor writer, I definitely got that a little bit more with the Ninth Configuration.
Yeah. Then in 1983, there was the novel Legion, which we already talked about a little bit. Yeah. Legion is more of a direct sequel to The Exorcist. Like, that one actually does directly reference the events from this book, and in that one, the character of Bill Kinderman is the main character. Now, this book was, of course, adapted into a film of the same name in 1973, which was directed by William Friedkin. The movie The Exorcist is one of my top 15 favorite films of all time. Like, that's just like, I don't even consider it, like, it is one of the greatest horror films ever made, but to me it's also one of the greatest films of any genre. Like, what do you think of the movie? I mean, I'm assuming you're a fan based on that.
I absolutely love the movie. So, I first watched the movie when I was 8 years old. I was so scared of it, but then I just, like, started to watch it more, and I was, like, really involved with it. And, you know, this was a time when pretty much, like, I was learning about religion and all that. So, like, when I was started to, like, believe in ghosts and all that, so it really, like, started to resonate with me. When I started to think about it, all the religious aspects, but even besides that, all the stuff having to do with, pretty much, like, family abandonment and all that, it's just, like, really hits home. Like, you know, I haven't had to deal with that, but I know some of my cousins had to deal with that, and so that just kind of resonated with me.
If you want to know more of my thoughts on the movie The Exorcist, I did a whole review of that years ago. But the film had a huge cultural impact, like that movie was a phenomenon. It was a blockbuster. Yeah. Like, I don't think it was quite as big as something like Jaws or Star Wars, but still, that was a huge film when it came out, and the horror genre probably wouldn't be the same today if not for that movie. Right. Even though I do think The Exorcist is more than just a horror film, it's also very much a drama film as well.
Yeah. And honestly, with the movie, like, the part that I felt most, like, squeamish at, I would say, it has nothing to do with the horror aspect. I felt like when Reagan was in the doctor's office and she was, like, getting a shot in her neck, like, I feel like that's the part where I got more squeamish, because you can actually see the pain in Reagan's face, and that's what really got to me.
Now, because of the phenomenon that The Exorcist was, Warner Brothers, who produced and distributed the film, did a sequel in 1977 called Exorcist II: The Heretic. What do you think of that movie?
Alright, well, I wouldn't say I do have a special place in my heart for it. Now, it is known to be, like, one of the worst movies, maybe, but, like, some things I do like about that movie is that they explored, like, different ways to do stuff, like the whole hypnotic lamp thing, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I thought that was really cool, honestly.
Okay.
Like, it was a little cheesy in the movie, but I thought as an idea, it was cool.
That movie did seem to take some stuff from the book in terms of the whole telekinesis aspect.
Yeah, right.
I do think the movie's beautifully shot. Like, John Boorman, who directed that, was a good filmmaker.
Yeah.
The issue is he didn't like the first one, so... it's a lot of unintentionally hilarious stuff in that movie, like James Earl Jones in a locust costume.
Yeah. Like, another one when, one of the people, like, they got possessed, and then he was like, "I am Pazuzu."
Yeah. I am Pazuzu. Honestly, it's a pretty shitty movie, honestly.
I mean,
has some positives, I guess, but yeah, the bad far outweighs the good in that movie, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Now, the Ninth Configuration, that, as we said, was sort of a spiritual sequel to The Exorcist, that had a film adaptation in 1980. I don't know if you would officially count that as part of the Exorcist film franchise, but since the two books were connected, you could argue that the two films are connected as well. Yeah. Have you seen the film adaptation?
I actually have not seen the film.
Oh, I highly recommend it. Like, if you liked the book, I highly recommend the film. The film had, like, Jason Miller, who played Damien Karras. Yeah. He's in the movie, obviously playing a different character. The character of the astronaut, who's called Billy Cutshaw in Ninth Configuration, he's played by Scott Wilson, who would go on to play Herschel in Walking Dead. It's a great movie. I highly, highly recommend Ninth Configuration. That's another thing where I've reviewed the book Ninth Configuration, and I've done a review on the movie. So go check those out if you want. And then the book Legion was adapted into the film Exorcist 3. What do you think of Exorcist 3?
I liked it. I mean, like, one of the most harrowing scenes was when the demon or whatever in the hospital just came up with like the giant scissors and just went right after the nurse, which I really liked. Which they actually explored again in the television show The Exorcist. Time, so.
Brad Dourif gave a phenomenal performance as the Gemini killer in that. Like, he was just... His performance was freaking electrifying in that movie. Jason Miller comes back as Damien Karras. I won't give too much away about that, but it's pretty interesting. And you had George C. Scott as Kinderman in that. Kinderman was played by Lee J. Cobb in the film The Exorcist, but was played by George C. Scott in Exorcist 3. And personally, I thought George C. Scott played the character of Bill Kinderman so much better than Lee J. Cobb did, at least in my opinion. Yeah. Now, around 2003 or 2004, Paul Schrader did a prequel to The Exorcist called Dominion, but the studio absolutely hated that, so they hired Rennie Harlin to come in and reshoot the whole movie, and it was released as Exorcist: The Beginning, but when that movie bombed at the box office, they just released Dominion, so you have two prequels to The Exorcist, and which one you consider to be canon, I guess, depends on which one you like better. Right. What do you think of the two prequel films?
Okay, well, I saw Exorcist: The Beginning first, of course, and I do like that one better, but because the way they had the woman getting possessed, Rachel, the way she was possessed, like, it felt very much like the original, just the facial aspect, like it was the same demon, maybe. Yeah. And with Dominion, they were, for the most, it was kind of the same in the most part, but I felt like some of the effects were more cheesy in Dominion.
Oh, yes.
One thing I really did like about Dominion is they actually brought back the face of Captain Howdy, or Pazuzu, however you want to... They brought it back on, like, the central character who was being possessed for a second, which I liked. So.
I think Dominion, on a storytelling level and on a character level, is a better film. Okay. I don't think Exorcist: The Beginning is as bad as people make it out to be. No. I would say they're both flawed films, but I enjoy both films for the most part. Yeah. But yeah, Dominion had some horrible special effects. I understand they cut Paul Schrader's budget and all that. I know William Peter Blatty actually really liked Dominion. Yeah. But yeah, they're both flawed films. Are they needed? I don't think that either one was really needed. Yeah. Now, recently there's been a TV series based on The Exorcist. I've never seen the series, so I'm going to let him take the reins on that.
Alright, so the series premiered on Fox a couple of years ago, the first season. And I will say this, I feel like it was the sequel of The Exorcist that we all deserved, that we all really wanted. So, basically, I don't want to give too much away, but the series pretty much, there's new priests and everything, but they talk about, the 1970s and what happened during that time.
Doesn't Gina Davis play Reagan?
Yes, that was something I didn't want to give away. But
I'm sorry.
Now that it's out there, I'll just say, you don't know about that in the very beginning, and then later you find out that she is Reagan. She, admits to the new father, because she uses a fake name throughout the first part of the series. there was another season after that, which pretty much it was its own deal. It didn't deal with the McNeils or anything. It just kind of had its own form and a new house, new possessions and everything. The only thing that pretty much was the same was the two priests and the clergy.
Now, because of the cultural impact that the film The Exorcist had, there have been a whole slew of rip-offs of that movie. Like, you had the Beyond the Door movies, which were Italian films. There was an Italian film called House of Exorcism.
Yeah.
Amityville 2, The Possession, which was an obvious rip-off of The Exorcist, even though that was based on a real-life case that actually happened after The Exorcist. But even, like, The Omen is definitely not a rip-off of The Exorcist, but it definitely came out right in the wake of The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Even today, like, a lot of James Wan's movies, like the Conjuring movies, are very much... Yeah, they're very much Exorcist-inspired. You still get, like... Okay, there was The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which... Even though that was
based on a true story.
Yeah, even though that was based on a real case, you know that movie wouldn't have come out if not for The Exorcist. There was Last Exorcism. There was an Exorcism movie that came out last year that sucked, but I completely forgot the name of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, and then you even have like rip-offs of that, like A Haunted House 2, where basically, it's like a scary movie. They make fun of that stuff. They made fun of The Last Exorcism in one of them. Yeah,
they made fun of Exorcist and Scary Movie too. There have been a lot of parodies of The Exorcist. There was actually a movie...
Simpsons, they did a parody of The Exorcist, like in one of the new Treehouse of Horrors, where Maggie was possessed by Pazuzu.
There was also a movie called Repossessed that actually had Linda Blair in it. There was... Richard Pryor did an Exorcist parody on Saturday Night Live, and I don't know if you ever saw the movie This Is the End.
Yes, yep.
Yeah, there's an Exorcist parody in that, which is freaking hilarious. Yeah, so this has been parodied and ripped off so many times. Like, even a movie like Constantine probably wouldn't exist in the same way if not for The Exorcist, or even the Hellblazer comics that movie is based on. This is not really a rip-off of The Exorcist, but I have a feeling this might have been inspired by The Exorcist, but even something like Stephen King's Salem's Lot, I saw some similarities. Like, the character of Father Callahan always reminded me a little bit of Damien Karras to a certain extent. Yeah. And even that book had some discussions about what is religion's place in this modern world of science.
Right.
So you could even see The Exorcist influence in something like that.
Right. It's funny you mention that, actually, with Stephen King, because I know in some of his books, like, he'll mention, like, The Exorcist. Yeah, like that was a great book in like one of his other books. So
that was our review on The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, and bye.
Bye.